Episode 112.
Blog Talk Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, now, from deep in the darkest forests of northern Minnesota, the show you've waited for. This is Grizzly's Growl. And I am honored to present our host, the man, the mystery, the legend. This is Grizzly.
Well, hello again, folks. This is Grizzly of the world-famous, internationally renowned Grizzly's Growls podcast, and we are doing once again a little special show live on Blog Talk Radio. Of course, it is 9 in the morning here in Central Time, and about about 10 o'clock on the East Coast, as on a Sunday. So I don't know that anybody's up other than us, but even so, we are live. I have a special guest today. My guest today is Martin Waxman of Palette PR out of Toronto, also of the Inside PR podcast. In fact, you may remember him as a guest on my 100th episode for Grizzly's Growls, where we were talking about a particular question I had about PR, which I turned out to be completely wrong about, and hopefully the same thing won't happen again. Mr. Waxman, are you there?
I am here. Very nice to be here, David.
Well, welcome to the show. And we discussed briefly what our general topic was going to be, which I believe is, well, how did we actually figure out how to phrase that? Something about,
I think
PR for
small business or for independents.
Mm-hmm. And for to a certain extent for the general public too.
Yeah.
It's been my general impression that it's been my impression that people's impressions of PR generally derive from their feeling that it doesn't really have anything to do with them. It's for big corporations, it's for major political figures and religious figures and celebrities, and really doesn't have a lot to do with the little folks. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think anybody who has a story to tell can use public relations or PR to help tell your story, especially if it's a story about your business or about, in this case, Grizzly's Growls podcast, say, that you want to build an audience for it and have more people listen to it and tell other people about it. PR is a really, really great tool for that. So you don't need to be a huge corporation to do it, and you don't need to spend, lots of money to do PR well. And in fact, oftentimes the personal relationships, the personal touch is what really, really helps. And so as an individual or as a small business owner, there are many, many tips and tricks and a lot of things that you probably are doing every day that you may not realize you're doing that can be called PR.
Now you have me intrigued, especially when you talk about growing my audience a little bit. Tell me more.
Well, I figured I'd try to use you a little bit as an example in all of this.
Okay, well, let's throw a few details in here. I've been doing the podcast for about 2 years. Background in unions, also currently unemployed. That's another aspect that I suppose would have to do with PR too, because you're really dealing with the public relationships and public impressions when you're trying to find another job. I'm just saying. So that's another aspect of things too. So
you're really right there. And in fact, anytime we get students who apply to us or call us for an information interview, I often tell them that applying for a job is very, very much like a PR project because they are trying to build relationships. They're trying to build awareness for themselves that will ultimately end in, not in a newspaper story or an article on a blog, but will end in a job. So how do you do that? And they can use a lot of the tools of PR to do that as well.
Okay. For example?
For example, if you are looking for a job,
okay,
what you want to do is you want to identify who you want to apply to,
okay,
which companies, which organizations, which people you want to apply to. And as you make that list, you look down the list and you think, okay, who do I know at those organizations, or who do I know who's connected to those organizations?
Okay.
And one of the greatest things to do is find out, how you are connected and see if you can get an introduction. The second thing is, what's your story? Because really PR is all about your story and what makes you different, better, best, unique, what makes you the podcast that people should want to tune into, to listen to, what makes you the person that a business wants to hire. So that's one of the most important things to figure out. What is your story? And oftentimes on a resume, we list everything, but you want to also have a little bit of your personality come through too. You don't want to make it over the top. You don't want to make it to the point where people don't believe it, but you want to at least have your story, your personality come out there. Same is true with the cover letter. You don't want to send out a cover letter that is such a form letter that the person on the other end knows that you've put "Dear insert name organization" here. You want to try to make it personal. And I would go so far as saying that if you want to connect with someone on LinkedIn, I mean, it's similar principles. What is your story? Why do you want to connect with them? Don't just go for that default, I'd like to add you to my personal network on LinkedIn. Try to make it a personal note as to why you would want to connect with that person. What is your story? Who are you?
Okay. Now, and I've, of course, I've been doing a little bit of reading and listening about PR in general. It seems to me, isn't that very, very closely related to what you do and what people might think of as conventional PR? Because a lot of that is relationships too, isn't it?
It is.
A lot about who you know?
Well, I think it's about who you know, but more important, it's about if you're the kind of person who can build relationships quickly and also maintain them. Because certainly when we do projects for a new client, oftentimes it'll be in a sector of business that we don't have any direct experience in. So how do we make relationships with the editors we're trying to reach? And this is something actually that I think would apply to any small business that's trying to get local PR, local publicity in your community. One of the ways of doing that is having your story told through the media or through other influencers, whether it's print media, your local daily newspaper, weekly newspaper, radio station, podcast. And a good way to get started on that is read, watch, and or listen to those outlets. Find out who the people are on those outlets, some of whom you may know if they're in your community, and find out what kinds of stories they're interested in or writing about. And then when you know your story, you have a much better idea of who you can contact to say, hey, I've got this amazing podcast out of Duluth. It's a local homegrown story, but I've got listeners from all over North America or all over the world. Here's what makes me different. Maybe you might want to write something on it. See what I mean?
There you go. I've actually been kind of amazed at just looking at some of the information I can get back on where my podcast goes. I've got, oh boy, the last I looked, I had people in about 80 countries listening or looking at the website or grabbing the audio. I don't understand. I'm not entirely clear. I suppose there might be a lot of people in some of those countries that are just trying to learn English, and I feel kind of sorry for them trying to learn English from listening to me. But
well, actually, that's a really good story for you, because if you say local Duluth podcaster has audience in 80 countries, there's a great headline.
There you go.
And all of a sudden you have this headline, you have this story, how you started out essentially with no listeners, right?
Well, that's pretty much the way. My mom still does not listen to my podcast, so I mean.
Well, maybe that's a good thing. Who knows?
Yeah, some days.
With all due respect to your mom.
There you go.
And to moms everywhere. But I think actually that's a really good story hook for you to potentially talk to some of the media that you may know in Duluth, where you're based, and to encourage them to write a story about you. And all of a sudden, you may be able to increase your audience in the greater Duluth area knowing also that people who read the article in Duluth have friends, family, people they know, beyond Duluth, other parts of Minnesota, other parts of Canada, the U.S.,
Sure.
Europe, Asia, you never know. And all of a sudden more people are talking about your story. And that's a small way of how PR can work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think also you might be potentially a great guest on a local radio show, talking about the difference between podcasting and radio and what it's like broadcasting to a very local community and to have, in essence, an international community. I mean, here we are. I'm in Toronto. You're in Duluth, and we're talking.
Yeah.
It's quite exciting. And we met virtually because of a connection through Twitter and through online and, hearing your podcast.
And me hearing your podcast. Now, what would you say to people that generally have the feeling that it really doesn't necessarily affect? I mean, for example, one thing I've been looking at, and actually I've been considering the topic once we decided that was what we were gonna focus on. There are people, for example, that don't think that PR really necessarily has anything to do with them in their lives, because I think, as I said, I believe earlier, that they think it has to do with big corporations and major political figures, major church figures, big celebrities, and so on. And actually, I was thinking about some aspects of it. For example, if somebody's in a church, they of course they have relationships with other people in the church, but they also might be part of a smaller organization within the church that does have to deal with the public on a regular basis. If you're doing charitable work, you might be an organization in a church that's doing charitable work, and you're having, and I guess some of the same solutions will really have to apply there too. Who do you know, and what connections do you have with people that can help to get the word out?
That's right, and I think any kind of charitable event or charitable initiative, there's a lot of potential to use PR to help spread the word, build an audience, build awareness, raise funds, get more people to volunteer for the worthy cause. The one caveat is media outlets, traditional media outlets, are being approached all the time with all sorts of different charitable initiatives. So again, it comes down to the story. What is your story? What makes you different, better, best? Why would that be of interest to the newspaper or blogger or online outlets, audience readership, the people who are watching them? So that's why it's really important to step back and have a great story as the first foundation, and then go out there and start to try to tell your story to people, and then get other people, hopefully, to tell that story and spread the news.
Mm-hmm. You know what, it strikes me, and I was thinking about this in relation to with what they call SEO now, search engine optimization. When you're looking at websites, there's particular things that you're supposed to do to your website that I've seen described in various places, and it suddenly struck me because I studied a little bit of journalism back. I was on the school paper in high school and so on, and studied at least the basics of news writing and so on. And it struck me that what they're asking you to do on a web page for search engine optimization is essentially the same thing you'd be doing for a news story. I mean, they want the title of the page to be something that is going to catch have the right impact for the engine to find you, and it's pretty much the same thing as writing a headline for a story. You want the description of the website to have the right information in there, and have the kind of phrases that are going to catch people's attention, and use the right keywords. Same thing pretty much as writing a lead for a news story. And as far as what they call meta tags and so on, it's pretty much using near the top of the website, near the top of the story. You're going to be using the keywords that are going to really convey the main topic that the story is about. And it seems to me that the same kind of principles would be what you'd be looking for in presenting your story to news outlets, really, that you want to give them at least a sense of what their headline is going to be, a sense of what their lead is going to be, and a sense of what those keywords and so on are going to be, that are going to be catching the eye. You're not exactly writing their story for them, but you are giving them kind of an idea of what they could turn into a story.
That's a great example, and yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I would say a really good news release or press release contains all those elements. Mm-hmm. You've got, hopefully, an eye-catching headline. You've got a really, really good lead that encapsulates the story and says to the person who's reading it, whether it's a journalist or a blogger or whoever, what is this story about? Why is it important to me? Why is it important to my readers? And why will my readers be interested in it and then also want to read more about it? And I think that's very, very important, whether you're doing a traditional news release or something called a social media news release, which is in essence a news release format that has a lot more functionality added to it. You can have links, you can have video, you can have quotes in it, you can have other visuals. In fact, earlier this week, Shell Holtz wrote a great post on the social media news release. So if anyone wants to search social media news release and Shell Holtz, you can get an idea of what the social media news release, how it works, how it's a little different from a traditional news release, but in essence, it's the vehicle that tells the story to who you're trying to reach, or can be.
I'd heard about those a little bit. I forget if it was in a podcast or if something I found on the web, but now, is there some particular site or something where they have those kinds of news, social media news releases? Is there like an official format for things, or it's pretty formalized? Or
there are a number of formats. Again, Shell Holtz has a really good post on it. Todd Deffren from PR Squared.
Okay.
He's the person who created the idea of a social media news release a few years ago. And if you go to his blog site, which is PR Squared, you'll be able to search social media news release and find an example. In Canada, there is a newswire outlet called Canada Newswire, and the URL is www.newswire.ca, and they are a news service for businesses, organizations, not-for-profits that put out traditional news releases. They also have a social media site, so you can go there and have a look at their social media news release. In the U.S., I would look at PR Newswire, which is the company that owns Canada Newswire, and they also put out corporate news. Now, if you're an individual in a community, would you put a release on one of the newswires? I don't think that's necessary. I think there are many other ways of distributing it, but if you're a company or an organization that wants to get your news out beyond your community, say to the country or to the region or to the state, the province, then you may want to consider posting it on a newswire and paying for it, because it's not inexpensive to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, with something like that, I mean, now a social media release that's directed at people that are doing social media, like you're trying to reach bloggers and such, then?
Yes, and other online publications. Now, again, going back, and a social media news release is something that anybody can do. So, for example, if you have a blog site or your own website, you can create a social media news release that has RSS feeds built in, that has tags so people know where to find it, that has a headline that's written in AP style, American Press style, or in Canada, CP style, which is what you'll see in most news outlets, and has all the links attached to it. So it's not necessarily something that you need to pay for. You can do that yourself.
Okay.
And it helps make you searchable too and findable.
Mm-hmm. So you could actually put something together with you following the appropriate format and just have it hosted on your own blog site or your own website without having to necessarily put it on the wires. So if you were communicating with somebody in social media who understood what one was, you could at least give them a link to your social media release rather than having to go through the wire services. If you don't think that the particulars of sending it out to everybody all over the country would really be necessarily your target audience.
That's right. And in that respect, something that's very important is just because you send an email or leave a message for a journalist, it's really important to also follow up with them, because they're very, very busy, and they get a lot of story ideas every single day. So if you want to get your story in front of them, it's really important for you as a small business, an individual who's, trying to promote a charitable event, say, you, David, trying to promote your blog, to take it on yourself to contact them.
Sure.
And you don't want to be a pest, and you also don't want to harass them, but I think it's important to say that for people to understand that in PR, I have a great story. I think it's a great story.
Mm-hmm.
It's my job to help the journalists see that it's a great story. And, sometimes the journalists will just say, you know what, that just doesn't work for me. Yeah, I write on this subject all the time, but I've just done a similar story, so thanks, but no thanks. And that's okay too, because the relationship, I think this is a really important point, with all media or whoever you're trying to reach is for the long term. If you think of customers, customer may come into your store, may look around one day and not buy, but just because they didn't buy today doesn't mean they're not going to buy tomorrow, next week, next month, or tell their friends what a great store, you should go in there.
Mm-hmm. So basically PR isn't just public relations, it's public relationships.
Yes.
And that's another thing too, because I was listening to an audiobook the other day about job hunting, and that was a point that he made in the book also, that that one important aspect of it is not just the initial sending out the resume, but following up on the resume, and not just doing the interview, but also following up on the interview. Even if it's just a matter of saying thanks for giving me the time to listen, taking the time to listen to me.
Absolutely, and you want to put yourself in the position of the person who's receiving it. So here you think you've got this amazing story, but the person who's receiving it is getting bombarded really with all sorts of stories, from every way, shape, or form. Plus they also have what their bosses are telling them. You've got to cover X, Y, or Z, or in your case Z, event that's happening or news that's happening around town.
Sure.
And so it's really important to know how big your story is in context. Sure, it's really big for you, but is it that important for the journalist? And if not, how do you make it that important? Or how do you say, okay, you know what, this really just merits a little one-paragraph listing, but something else that I'm doing may merit a feature article or inclusion in an article with 2 or 3 other stories.
Sure. Or something else that you're doing might be something that would be the main point of the story, and they might also, by the way, mention that other thing that you happen to have going on, so that couldn't hide either.
That's right.
So, yeah.
So it's all for the long term, though. It's really, really interesting, and it's something that many people don't realize, because they think it's just a one-shot situation, and it really, really isn't. Oftentimes a journalist will say no, but the no doesn't mean no, don't ever call me again. The no may mean no, this just doesn't work this time around, but I would be very interested in hearing from you again.
Sure. Or it may...
And like any...
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, like any relationship, it doesn't happen overnight. It does take time.
The other thing I was thinking about too is once you have you've spoken to this journalist, and well, no, that doesn't seem like the kind of thing that we're going to be covering right now. And well, who else would you suggest, or is there somebody that who else would you think that would be a good person to talk to about this, or that kind of thing, or do you think there are better outlets for it? Because I mean, they know their business, and they know journalism, and they know journalists, and it couldn't hurt to ask what they think the best direction would be.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good idea, to get some feedback from them. Again, you don't want to take too much of their time, especially if they're on deadline. Now, this is a little tip. If a journalist ever says to you, I'm on deadline, don't go into your story. Just say, thanks very much, I'll call you back later.
Understood.
And then just get off the phone as quickly as possible, because it means that they are really not focused on anything but what they're doing, and they have a deadline. They've got to reach that or meet that deadline. Otherwise, they'll get in trouble. But absolutely, if you're engaged with someone, say, if it doesn't work for you, is there anyone better at this paper that I should call? And a lot of this comes from knowing and understanding media. As I said earlier, reading the newspapers, listening to the radio, watching TV. If you just approach a journalist and you've never read anything they've written, how do you know how interested they will be? You may look at a media database, and there are many of those that are available that companies use. And you can see that this person covers podcasts, for example. if there is a podcast reporter anywhere.
Sure.
But if you've never read anything they've written, and I'm talking about a print journalist or a blogger, and you contact them about your podcast, how do you know that what you're saying is relevant? I mean, it's actually a great tool with having media, because you know essentially what a journalist or reporter's point of view is, or how they write, or what they're interested in, just by what they've done in the past. And that helps when you're trying to build a relationship and trying to find a story that's relevant for them.
Sure. And the flip side of that, for example, when you're for example, if I was trying to promote my podcast, which I really ought to be doing, come to think of it,
yes,
would now that you mention it, would be look at, you're not just looking at what this particular person that you want to talk to is talking about, but look who is talking about the things that you do. I would imagine that our local paper has somebody, or I don't know if it's so much true anymore, but I think they probably have the person on staff who is the guy that knows about all that new media stuff and the blogging and the podcasting and the whatnot. Mm-hmm. And, so by looking into that, you may not only find out what this current person that you want to talk to is doing, but also who is the right person to talk to. Maybe there is a main guy, and maybe by looking at this one guy, you say, well, wait a minute now, this fellow over here has done 3 different stories on new media and podcasting and Twitter, and this guy's got a Twitter account. So that's another aspect of it. I hadn't really thought about that. Thanks for pointing that out.
Well, I think that's I think that's something that if you wanted to, say, promote your podcast locally, because it's a great way to start in your community, to build up your audience there, that would be a really good way of doing it. Just approaching this person. And again, I think the story that you have listeners in 80 countries is a great story, because here you are, you started out with one listener essentially, and you built this podcast, you built your point of view, you know, what the podcast is about, and it's something that I think the community would be interested in. And also, maybe some local businesses might be interested, because suddenly you have an expertise in creating a podcast, promoting a podcast, and they're thinking, okay, I want to do something like this. I should call David and maybe hire him to help us. So, you know, there's a couple of different ways that this can potentially work.
Okay. The other aspect of it, too, is that even, like you say, even if it's not something that happens now, I've got the situation where I'm looking for a job. I'd like the job to be in broadcasting, just saying. And getting the word out about the podcasting also helps with the job hunting aspects of it. And there's a lot going on there. And then, like you say, even if it's something that doesn't happen now, you've already talked to the person, they know who you are. So the next time they say, oh yeah, I remember talking to you about whatever the last time around. What have you got this time? And maybe this time it'll work. You just never know. So, well, we were only going to devote 30 minutes of your time to this, because you have other things to do. I guess you were going to go pick up some family and whatnot?
Yes, I have to head out to the airport to pick up my daughter, who's coming back, which will be kind of fun.
Okay, well, I appreciate you taking the time. Did you have any last thoughts before we ring the closing bell on the discussion?
Well, I think just to remember what it all goes back to story and relationships, and everything that you do every day in terms of maintaining relationships works for public relations. But, you know, figure out what your story is and who you want to reach, and then try to build those relationships there. And if it doesn't work the first time, you know, keep trying, because it eventually will, and hopefully it'll help build your audience.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me today, and have a good Sunday. And folks, thanks for listening, and we'll talk at you later. Thank you for listening to Grizzly's Growls, the life and times of a minor local celebrity. If you like the show, tell your friends. If you don't like the show, tell your enemies. Leave an email, audio, or video comment on the website at grizzliesgrowls.com. This show was provided under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Talk at you later.